Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, since everybody's not talking, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, today's lesson is from Ecclesiastes. And I'm pretty much going to ignore what the book says because it didn't seem to make much sense. And I'm going to ignore the teacher book because I forgot to come get it. So we're going to be winging it to a certain degree today. Ecclesiastes is part of the Jewish Bible, called the Tanakh, as opposed to the Law or the Penta, whatever it is, the first 5 books. And it's also in our Old Testament in a section that's referred to as wisdom literature. Now, there's one part of Ecclesiastes that is familiar, and I bet you will all recognize this. In fact, these 8 verses were used verbatim as the lyrics in a Pete Seeger song they wrote back in 1959, but you probably don't know about that. You may remember it if you listened to rock music during the 60s. There was a song called Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds, Birds with a Y. And other than the words turn, turn, turn sprinkled through it, it is almost verbatim the King James version of chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Also, you probably heard it at funerals. It's a fairly common, popular thing to be used at funerals. In fact, I read it at my uncle's funeral a few years back. And so just to remind everybody what it says, I'm going to ask Sally to do the first reading.
Okay. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to get, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to cast away. A time to rend, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time to love, and a time to hate. A time of war, and a time of peace.
Okay, that's probably the only part of Ecclesiastes that will sound familiar to you. And if you think about it, we've probably not had many lessons in Ecclesiastes ever. And the rest of Ecclesiastes is very different from those 8 verses. So what about the rest of Ecclesiastes? What do we know about it? Who wrote it? When was it written and why? Well, in the very first verse of Ecclesiastes, it says, "These are the words of the teacher of the assembly, David, son, king of Israel." So this is actually from Solomon, and he probably didn't write it. He probably had a scribe that copied it down as he dictated, and then they selected what they wanted to keep. And then if you go to the very last part of chapter 12, there's a little summary that was put in either by the scribe or by some monk who was copying it years later that tried to sum the whole thing up in about 3 sentences. But most of Ecclesiastes is allegedly the words of King Solomon. Now, Ecclesiastes, is that a word that is familiar with you all? I mean, you know what that means? Where it came from? I never knew. So I looked it up. And here's what it said. Ecclesiastes is a phonetic transliteration of a Greek word, which translates to the Hebrew name of its nominal author, which is Kohelet. So I don't know why they were calling Solomon Kohelet, but as we know, many times things in the Bible are not attributed to the actual person that wrote it. For example, many of the Paul's letters were actually written by one of his followers, but they got more. It's like when you write an article for a journal, if you put the big guy's name up front, more people will read it. So I think it's that sort of thing. And so because it was Solomon, we know it came from about 950 BC, about 3,000 years ago. And most likely it is Solomon's thoughts as recorded by a scribe. Now, I'm going to take a detour because as we read through the rest of it, it's all about work and working. And that always reminds me of a musical called Working. It came out in 1977. It was based on a book by a guy named Studs Terkel that may be familiar with you. Studs was a little bit of a lefty, but not like today's lefties. He was not crazy. It's a nonfiction book, and what happened is actually I think it was a radio show. Studs interviewed all these working people and on his radio show, and then he selected a bunch of those interviews and condensed them down and put them in a book that he wrote in 1974. So it's fairly contemporary. In 1978, it was produced as a play, as a musical, initially in Chicago, and then it moved to Broadway in New York. It lasted 3 weeks, so it was not Cats. At least it didn't have the longevity of Cats. But in this play, there were 20 or more, depending on exactly which version of the play you saw, or the musical, people that had what you would consider regular jobs. And they would talk about their jobs, but in some of them, they just spoke, and most of them, the actors sang about their job. These are jobs like a fireman, a waitress, a mill worker, a stonemason, a trucker. So they're just ordinary working people, and their discussions they're talking about what they got out of their jobs, what they liked about it, what they're proud about, as well as the difficulties that they encountered along the way. So you probably remember that Gwen was kind of big on performances, and she was always getting into these little theater groups. And back around 1992, she got into a theater group in Florida that was putting on this working thing, and she did the role of a teacher named Rose Hoffman. And it was an amateur production, but it was fairly good. And Rose had a song, and I'm not going to try to sing it, obviously, or even read the whole thing, but I'll read the first three, I guess, are verses, without music, of course. It starts out, "My classroom was always a showcase. In those days, we did it ourselves, with colorful pictures and charts on the wall, a snowman in winter, a pumpkin in fall. And all my supplies were in neat little piles on shelves." Continues, "My children were always respectful. When the principal came, they would rise. If I had to leave for a minute or two, they always found something constructive to do, and everyone sat in their places according to size." So you see, she is, I don't want to say enjoying, but she's talking about how she is rewarded by doing this job and by doing it well and things turning out the way they're supposed to. Now it takes a turn. "But kids don't know how to behave anymore. You ask them to rise and they ask them, 'What for?' We confiscate weapons and drugs at the door." And then that theme kind of continues through the next 4 or 5 verses. So we see two halves of this job. On one hand, gratification, pride in the work of doing good things. On the other hand, challenges and things that make the job more difficult. Okay, so we got pride and frustration of working Americans, and that's relatively contemporary, 1970s, 90s. So let's jump back 3,000 years to Ecclesiastes. I told you that in chapter 1 it said that the speaker was Solomon, but it also goes on to say he is incredibly successful. He's the richest known person that's known. He has all these great works. God selected him to build the new temple. I'm not talking about the little cheesy temple in Jesus' time. I'm talking the big golden temple that was built in Solomon's time. You may recall that God told David he had too much blood on his hands. His son was going to build the temple. Solomon lived in total luxury. He had servants coming and going. He had live performing music anytime he wanted it. I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. He had 700 wives. He was blessed by God. In fact, compared to his father, Solomon had it too easy. He got his job the old-fashioned way, and he inherited it. Whereas David had to fight for it. Remember, David was originally Saul's favorite, and then Saul got weird and decided David was his enemy, and he hunted and hounded him all over. And if it wasn't for Saul's son Jonathan, who basically gave David advance notice to run from each of his hiding places, Saul would have hunted him down and killed him. So, David's life was much harder, and Solomon's life was comparatively easy. But as we get into this next reading, you'll see he's wondering, what's it all for? You remember the movie Alfie? What's it all about, Alfie? Well, it's kind of like that. He finally gets the point, and he's feeling empty. He's wondering what's going to become of all he's accomplished, all he's built. He realizes he's going to die just like the poorest person in the land, and you can't take it with you. So everything that he has built and accomplished will eventually turn to dust. And so he's kind of feeling down. He's asking the basic question that we all ask: what is the meaning of life? Here I am, I have succeeded beyond all measure, and I'm going to die, and somebody's going to inherit all this, and they'll probably fritter it away. So, on one hand, he should be over the moon. I mean, no one is as successful as Saul by all human measures. On the other hand, he's complaining, he's depressed. He's a regular Mary Sunshine, isn't he? So, Sally, would you read the second reading?
Sure. I hated the things I worked so hard for here under the sun, because I will have to leave them to someone who comes after me. And who knows whether that one will be wise or foolish. Either way, that person will have control over the results of all my hard work and wisdom here under the sun. That too is pointless. I then gave myself up to despair as I thought about all my laborious hard work under the sun. Because sometimes those who have worked hard with wisdom, knowledge, and skill must leave the results of their hard work as a possession to those who haven't worked hard for it. This too is pointless. It's a terrible wrong. I mean, what do people get for all their hard work and struggles under the sun? All their days are pain, and their work is aggravation. Even at night, their hearts don't find rest. This too is pointless. There's nothing better for human beings than to eat, drink, and experience pleasure in their hard work. I also saw that this is from God's hand. Who can eat and find enjoyment otherwise? Because God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please God. But to those who are offensive, God gives the task of hoarding and accumulating, but only so as to give it all to those who do please God. This too is pointless and chasing after the wind.
Okay. Happy guy, isn't he? Okay, before we jump into the next piece of the reading, notice how in the next section, and this is in the following chapter, it shifts from Saul's focus on himself to looking at the rest of the people, everyone else. He ponders the lives not just of himself, but now he starts considering the lives of others, what we would consider ordinary people. And he observes that ordinary people seem to get a lot of pleasure out of life, perhaps more than the king. We see God's hand in providing for the ordinary people and the joy that they're able to experience in life, even though the king is having a hard time seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So Sally, if you go into the third reading, please.
What do workers gain from all their hard work? I have observed the tasks that God has given human beings. God has made everything fitting in its time, but has also placed eternity in their hearts, without enabling them to discover what God has done from beginning to end. I know that there's nothing better for them but to enjoy themselves and do what's good while they live. Moreover, this is the gift of God, that all people should eat, drink, and enjoy the results of their hard work. I know that whatever God does will last forever. It's impossible to add to it or take away from it. God has done this so that people are reverent before him. Whatever happens has already happened, and whatever will happen has already happened before, and God looks after what is driven away.
Okay, so Saul's saying here that the average person in his kingdom has everything they need to be happy, while Saul, who's got all the gold, doesn't, which is kind of a big contradiction. But the main thing to take out of this is the role of God in all this. God has provided everything that the people need and to really be happy, and the things that they don't have, they don't need. All right, before we jump into the last section, I'll preview that a little bit, is about Saul's recognition of the importance of a balanced life. Work is important. In fact, you can't live without work. Somebody's got to work anyway. But it's not the most important thing. Conversely, idleness, i.e. sitting around not doing any work at all, is foolish, because at least back then people let you starve to death and you'd be dead. So the trick is to balance work and pleasure, to work enough that you can live, but to have enough time and resources left over that you can enjoy life. He also, before he ends, he talks about the importance of social interaction, of people having friends, because even if you're incredibly wealthy, but you don't have any friends, you don't have any family, you don't have any, you may have family, but people that you are close to, that you interact with and you have relationships with, is all pretty pointless. So he's talking about the pointlessness of a solitary life, even in great opulence. So Sally, read the last section, please.
I also observe that people work hard and become good at what they do, only out of mutual envy. This too is pointless, just wind chasing. Fools fold their hands and eat their own flesh. But better is resting with one handful than working hard for two fistfuls and chasing after wind. Next I saw under the sun something else that was pointless. There are people who are utterly alone, with no companions, not even a child or a sibling. Yet they work hard without end, never satisfied with their wealth. So for whom am I working so hard and depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is pointless and a terrible obsession.
Alrighty. The point he talked about eating themselves, he was talking about people who don't work, don't produce anything, and therefore don't have food and drink. In other words, a sustenance of life. To talk about work with one hand and the other hand not, he's talking about balancing between your work life and all other dimensions of human existence. So those were kind of obscure references, but that's what they were referencing to. So where does that leave us? What if we try to sum all this up, what does it mean? Here's what I got out of it. First of all, God made the world for man. The order's not important, but God provided everything on earth that man was going to need to survive, but he was going to have to do some work for it. Not impossible work, but have to do work. In fact, that even goes back to Adam and Eve. If you remember when God put them in the garden, he said, okay, I got a job for you. Your job is to tend this garden. So from the very beginning, God created the earth, created man, and gave man a job to do. And that continues to this day. So God expects us to work to live. Man needs to work to survive, but he can also derive satisfaction from work. Now, I did not see this in the writings of Solomon, but I do see this in the real world, that many people, not everybody, but many people are proud of their work. They are glad of the contribution they make and are interactive society where we have economics, where people don't live by themselves and do everything they need. People specialize. Some people maybe make shoes, some people maybe grow food, etc., and then they trade with each other. And as a result of that, they're able to do good for each other by doing that. And many people take pride in the work, that they're good at what they're working. That's another thing I disagree with Solomon on. He said, well, people are just, they just try to be really good at the work for, own selfish reasons. Well, maybe it's a selfish reason, but if they try to be good at the work because they are just proud of doing the work and doing it well and realizing that other people are benefiting from their work, I don't have the same view as Solomon expressed on that. Another thing is work is essential for human development. If people did not have to work, I mean, supposing we were filled with chlorophyll and all we had to do is lay out in the sun and, we would get all the nourishment we needed that way, we would not develop as people, as human beings. The work requires us to use our mind, to use our bodies, to interact with other people, to learn things like language, for example. So work is actually a key to the development of civilization as we know it, where people interact with other people and do things for the benefit of other people and vice versa. But it's only one dimension of a happy life. So I agree, Solomon is exactly right here. If a person devotes their entire life to their job, and we may have known people like that, what do they say? All work makes Johnny a dull boy. And so that is the thing that Solomon is saying too. Okay, I've heard this a lot, but I'll say it anyway. Life isn't always fair, but it can still be good. Now, looking back, how are things for us today different than they were for Solomon back 3,000 years ago? In a lot of ways, they're the same. A lot of the things that you read that Solomon says, you will recognize in your life or in the lives of people that you know or people you've seen in the movies or whatever. But there's one big difference, and that is we have Jesus. We have the Gospels. And what was known at the time of Solomon has been totally rewritten by the teachings, the life, and the promises of Jesus. For example, back in Solomon's day, they did not believe in life after death. In fact, even in Jesus' day, some of the Jewish sects did not believe in life after death. So, all they knew is that when you're alive, you had to follow the rules, and after that, who knows? And Jesus has brought us the gospel that, I don't know if life is the right thing to call it, but there is existence after death. We do not end at our death, and Jesus brought us that assurance. And so we are starting off in a much better place than the people were back in Solomon's day. And one thing Solomon said I think is very poignant, and that is that man's accomplishments are temporary. No matter what you do on this earth, whether you build something, particularly physical accomplishments, it all turns to dust. Maybe next year, maybe in 100 years, but it all eventually turns to dust. The pyramids have done pretty good, but by and large, almost everything that has been built by man has been transient in nature. And only God's works endure. So with that, I will wrap it up, unless someone has anything you want to add or subtract. Going once, going twice. All right, let's call it quits.